Okay, chapter 17, the markets for labor and other factors of production. So we'll mostly spend most of this chapter talking about labor, and then we have a little thing at the end there where I talk about some of the other. So I'm sure that you remember from way back in the beginning of this course that labor is one of the factors of production. So our factors of production are land or natural resources, labor, and capital. So what we're talking about here really applies to all three of these, but we're going to talk mostly about labor. So the demand for labor, or the demand for workers, is a derived demand, which means, and really any of these factors are derived demand. So the demand for labor depends on the demand for whatever it is that labor produces, or the demand for any natural resources depends on the demand for the product that natural resources produces. So if the demand for college education goes up, then the demand for professors to teach that will go up as well. So it's a derived demand. So it's not just on its own. It kind of depends what's going on with whatever it produces. So the example in your book is talking about Apple's demand for workers. So Apple needs to consider, so they have to decide how many workers they're going to hire. So they'll look at how much extra each worker can produce. And so this is the marginal product of labor. How much extra output do I get for each extra worker that I hire? We talked about this back in chapter 11, I think, 10 or 11, I think, and how it goes down, right? After a while, hiring more workers doesn't add as much to your output. But equally important to how much extra output I can get per worker is how much extra revenue I get from that extra output. So this is the marginal revenue product of labor. And these go together, right? The more extra additional output I get, the more revenue I get. So that makes sense. But now we're going to also have to factor in how much it costs me for that labor. So the marginal revenue product of labor is the price that I'm selling this product for. So that's the revenue times the marginal product, the extra output that I get per worker. Okay. So if we look at that here in a little chart, so here's the number of workers and the output that each one can do. So we have the marginal product of labor right here. That's the extra output per worker. Okay? So when I go from 0 workers to 1, I get 6 extra. When I hire the second guy, he can produce 5 extra. And we keep going like that. Then this is the product price. So that's my revenue. And so then you just take these two together and you get the marginal revenue product of labor, which is the extra revenue I get for each additional worker that I hire. Then here's the wage that I'm paying those workers. So that's my cost. So if I take my revenue minus my cost, this is the additional profit from one more worker. So what I can see, hiring the first worker, the second worker, and the third worker keep adding to my profit. And the fourth worker is okay. But when I get to this fifth worker, what this tells me is that the fifth worker is going to add $400 in revenue, but $600 in cost, so my profit would go down. So I would not hire that fifth worker. I would hire 4 workers in order to get the most revenue for that cost right there. So the first things here, the marginal revenue product, we did that before. So now we're just taking the marginal revenue product times the product price to turn that into revenue, and then compare the revenue to the cost. So we come up with a rule: if the marginal revenue product is greater than the wage, we should hire more workers. If it's less than the wage, then we should hire fewer workers. And if the marginal revenue product is exactly equal to the wage, then that means we're hiring the optimal number of workers and we're maximizing our profit. So now I want to talk about the supply and demand of labor. So at each wage, so it's supply and demand, just like supply and demand was in chapter 3, except now it's labor. So the demand for labor are the employers, okay? Those are the people that are demanding workers. So the demand is now made up of the firms or the employers. And so we can see, it looks like a demand curve, just like we're kind of used to seeing a demand curve. So here's the demand. So here's the price or the wage, and here's the quantity. So that would be the number of workers that it's hiring. And we have the same thing that we had back in chapter 3, where a change in the price leads to a change in the quantity demanded, except now the price is the wage and the quantity demanded is the number of jobs. So if we start out here, at let's say $10 and we hire 200 workers, if the price goes up to 15, it doesn't shift the curve. We just move to a different point on the same curve. So, for example, this is exactly what you see when minimum wage goes up. If the wage goes up, the quantity demanded of workers will go down, which is why you tend to see unemployment go up when wages go up. And the same thing, if wages go down, then firms can afford to hire more workers, and so we'll see that shift. But there are, just like in regular demand, there are things that can shift the entire curve to the left and to the right. So a change in the price causes a movement along the curve, a change in there, just like in chapter 3. But there are things that can shift the entire demand curve. So these are things not wage, so not the price, other than that can change it. One of them is increases in human capital, okay? So we talked a little bit about human capital at the beginning, but this is basically the skills and experience of the workers. So you probably recognize that the longer somebody has been doing something, the more the faster they're going to be. So the more output you get out of those workers. So workers coming out with more skills or workers with more experience are going to be more productive. So they're going to be more, produce more output and therefore more revenue. That's why education is important, because it increases the human capital. Changes in technology. Now, does this increase or decrease the demand for labor? And it depends on the labor. We're going to talk about this a little bit. But basically, if it's unskilled labor, then it would decrease the demand. So the technology is essentially replacing the workers. If it's skilled labor, then it actually increases the demand, because that same worker can produce more, or it can be more productive because of the technology. And so more productive means more revenue, more profit. So the technology, it really kind of depends on what type of worker you are. The third thing that can shift the entire demand curve are changes in the price of the product. So remember that the marginal revenue product was the price times the marginal revenue, or the marginal product, the marginal product of labor. So if you're producing the same amount, but the price of that product goes up, then the revenue goes up and the profit goes up. So I'll want more workers to produce that. Changes in the quantity of other outputs. So this will be like capital, for example. So if I have more machines, then I need more workers to make those machines. Or if the other inputs become cheaper, then again, I can make more profit, so I'll want more workers there. And then the number of firms in the market, more firms doing that means, like, if another community college opened around here, they would need more instructors, or another warehousing thing, they need more workers for it. So all of those are going to increase the demand for workers. Or if people leave the market, then there'll be fewer workers demanded at every price. Now the labor, okay, now this is the workers, right? The supply of labor are the workers. That's you and I. So people have to decide how many hours they're going to work, right? So they have a limited amount of time, and basically you have this kind of labor versus leisure trade-off. So the more you work, the less leisure time you have. The more leisure time you have, the less hours you're supplying for work. So people have to decide how many they're going to supply. For most people, this is what the supply curve looks like. The higher the wage, the higher the quantity they're willing to supply. If you're making $10 an hour, then let's say you will supply 40 hours a week. But if the wage goes up to 15, or let's say this. Let's say at $10 an hour, you're only willing to work part-time and you're going to work 30 hours a week. But if the wage goes up to 15, then you'll go down here and you'll be willing to work 40 hours a week. You're willing to give up leisure time to take this extra wage here. So for the most part, this is what the supply of labor looks like for most of us. Now, when the wage gets to a certain point, we have this really unusual thing. We have this backward bending supply curve. And so let's say this is, I don't know, $1,000 an hour, okay, right here. And so up until that point, the higher the wage, the more leisure time you're willing to give up to work more. But to get to a certain point, and you don't really need that to pay your bills, right? And you would like to be able to enjoy some of your time. And so do you really want to work 80 hours a week? And so at a certain point, you actually supply less labor because you can afford to do that. The more you make, the fewer hours you have to put in. If you're making $10 an hour, you probably have to put in a lot of hours to pay your bills. But the higher the wage goes, the less you have to put in to get to the same point. So maybe it's not even $1,000. Maybe this is a salary. And once the salary gets up to a certain point, you say, well, I'm willing. And this is going to be different for different people. So if you're a single guy that's 20 years old, you're probably just going to put in a lot of hours and get as many as you can. But if you are, say, a mom, and you say, you know what, I would rather stay home if I can, and so, or I don't want to work 2 jobs anymore. Once the wage gets to a certain point, I'm going to supply less hours. So this is where we would all like to get to this point where we can say, you know what, I just really don't want to work 2 jobs anymore. I don't want to put in more hours. But that doesn't kick into a kind of a higher point. But that's something we see in labor that we really don't see in other things. So for the most part, it looks like a regular supply curve. This is a kind of a unique situation here. But there are things, again, so for the most part, a change in the wage moves me along the curve. But there are things that can shift the entire supply curve. So one is changes in population. So, or it could be changes in demographics too. So it could be like age. So if we say, here's the demand for workers, and here's the supply of workers, and let's say wage was $10. If the millennials hit the workforce full-time or full force, they all graduated, that's going to increase the supply of workers. So it's could be number of people or just the age within there. Supply goes here, and what does that do? That drives the wage down, more workers. And the other thing is changing alternatives. So the alternatives could be going to school. It could be, that's probably a big one over there, but or it could change within the market. So the supply of retail workers might go down as people shift over to other things. So I'm going to stop this one here, and then I'm going to pick back up, and I'm going to put kind of supply and demand together.